Now we get to tier 4, and tier 4 is really the wild cards. It's the guys that you don't really know a whole lot about in terms of their role on the team this year. I mean, look, they could end up bringing, eventually getting to, a spot where they're taking significant snaps for Carolina. But going into the season, we're looking at them as guys that are buried a little bit on the depth chart, that it's going to take a little bit of time for them to get on the field. I start with Javarius Green, the guy who, was also part of that wide receiver class that Carolina brought in last year with Shipp and Taylor. And yeah, I mean, he's a guy in the slot, very shifty, your typical slot receiver, very explosive. There could be, some reps for him as a kick returner if Carolina wants to conserve Chris Culver in that area. But it's with how good Chris Culver was returning kicks last year, I don't expect that they're going to do that. He's also a guy that could factor in as a punt returner, but I think he provides some nice depth at the slot position. And then you talked about Adrian Wilson as a guy that Carolina got as a transfer from Colorado. He had been committed to a lot of schools beforehand, but another explosive playmaker, former 4-star wide receiver. So definitely a guy that has some talent there. And the same thing with Nathan Leacock, another former 4-star wide receiver that transfers in from Purdue after being with them in the spring. Prior to that, he was with Tennessee, in-state guy that Carolina did recruit, and they're hoping he can sort of find his footing here. So a very interesting group. I think there's almost a 4A and 4B. I think those three guys that I just talked about right there, I'm very interested to see what they're able to do this season, if any of them are able to really climb into the 2 deep and maybe get some of those snaps that we talked about, Alex Taylor, Paul Billups, and those guys taking last year.
Let's play a game really quick. Do you think Adrian Wilson finishes the season before entering the transfer portal?
Yeah, I think he'll finish the season. Now, the better question would be, do you think he's on this roster at this time next year? My answer would be yes, but my confidence level would probably be about a 55%.
Yeah, it's going to be because he came to Colorado. Was it Arizona State where we initially had committed to?
I know TCU was in there somewhere. There's so many different ones.
So, I mean, that guy's maybe got the most colorful wardrobe of all the different colleges he's committed to. Bunch of wasted gear has gone his way. But there is talent there. You don't end up at Colorado with a chance to play for Coach Prime by accident. And so I think of all the guys you mentioned here in Tier 4, I think he's a one that could really, I think, stand out and maybe emerge as a guy that if he's not in the transfer portal and is back on this roster next year, we could be talking about him having a much larger role. I think one thing you got to like about Nathan Leacock is he's bringing some size at 6'3". Mm-hmm. So Carolina's getting a little bit bigger. I think that's going to be a big focal point. But just one catch. Last year, same thing with Green, just a single catch, and so I think this is where it really kind of starts to teeter off for Carolina. Those first 6 guys in the first 3 tiers. I think you could see all of them playing significant snaps and there being, production of consequence. It's when you get to here, which is why these guys are in Tier 4, that it's really just uncertain. I think best case scenario is you take advantage of a week 2 game against Charlotte, a game against Richmond, where you can just get these guys on the field, get some snaps, and get some – and really start to develop them in your system. And maybe, because these guys, if they were to stick around with how young they are, these guys could be the future of the position group. So we're banking on player development being much more accelerated under Bill Belichick and his coaching staff. The only way to develop guys to get them on the field, I don't think you're going to see these dudes on the field on Labor Day night against TCU. Can you see them in week 2? Can you see them in week 3? Can you blow out a team or two in ACC play to where you can see them go against the competition? They'll go in on a week out basis. That's kind of that. That's all going to be determined. But if I had to bank on either of anyone in this tier becoming a impactful player for Carolina in some shape, form, or fashion, I would go Adrian Wilson, just given the fact he's a high end 4-star recruit, was going to play for Coach Prime. I think he'll be motivated to kind of shut up the doubters of all the transfer stuff, even though I made a joke about it. I think he would be the guy at Circle that could emerge as a guy that has a much larger role than maybe we anticipate as we sit here in late July.
Yeah, I mean, he's only a true freshman. I mean, the thing is that he's moved around to all these schools. He still has yet to play a college season. This is his first year at the college level. So there's so much potential to his game that I think he's going to have a chance to succeed. It's just whether or not he ends up sticking here with Carolina. Leacock, I think, is also really interesting because of his size. I think his ability to win some of those contested catches over the top, a guy that can pluck the football away from defensive backs could certainly be something that could get him on the field. But yeah, I mean, if we're being honest, I think these guys in this tier, you're looking at them as primarily backups. And unless there are some injuries, you're probably not going to see these guys this season. You're hoping that they're guys that can establish themselves in practice and maybe make a run at being, significant contributors next year. If you are to lose, a guy, you're going to lose Kobe Paysour, but if you are to lose a guy like Chris Culliver, maybe he has a breakout season and goes to the NFL or something like that. Transfers are always something that could possibly happen. By the way, I went through Adrian Wilson. This is the path that he took. TCU decommits, Oregon commits on the same day, decommits from Oregon, takes an official visit to Arizona State, commits to Arizona State, decommits from Arizona State on October 23rd, commits to Colorado on October 26th, and then eventually enrolls at Colorado, spends the spring with them, enters the transfer portal on April 16th, and commits to Carolina on April 17th. So just a wild, wild road for this young man so far, but hopefully he's a guy that ends up sticking at Carolina. Now you get to the second part of tier 4, which is where you get Jason Robinson Jr. and Dayton Sneed. Now, I think Jason Robinson Jr., certainly you can make a case that he should be in that 4A category, should be a guy that we're talking about a little bit more. I just think he's going to be buried behind so many guys at that slot position, and especially if they are going to use Kobe Paysour in the slot some this year. I mean, you got to think already ahead of him is going to be, Isaiah Johnson, Javarius Green, and then he could potentially be that third guy there, but he could also be a fourth guy if they use Paysour in the slot. So, I mean, it's asking a lot of him, I think, this year to come in and break through. He was a guy that was a real standout last year in practices at Washington. They said he had a lot of upside, but he ends up coming to Carolina. Hopefully that upside is going to be able to show through, but I don't necessarily think that this is the year. I think he's probably going to be buried on the depth chart, and we'll be, lucky to probably see the field at some point this year.
Yeah, I think we'll be talking about him in a much larger capacity in 2026 as opposed to 2025. But again, that's where I stress the importance of being able to, get some big wins under your belt in terms of margin of victory, or maybe you can just get this guy on the field and start to evaluate him and see what he has. ESPN lists him at 500 or at 5'10", 150 pounds. So
yeah, he's tiny.
You would imagine he would be a little shifty fella, probably a guy that can a quick titch can maybe spin and make something happen. Which could make him a lot of fun to watch in the open field. I just don't know how much of that is going to happen this year. But if this is a guy that stays in the program, doesn't transfer after one season in Chapel Hill, I do think there's a chance where when we're sitting here in 2026, he's bare minimum maybe listed in tier 3 when we do the position preview maybe at the back end of tier 2.
Yeah, I think with him at that size, 5'10", 150 pounds, you are bringing him into the system and you are hoping that your nutrition team can bulk him up just a little bit. That's what I think this year is going to be for him. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he's a guy that comes out of nowhere and really surprises. Maybe he is challenging Javarius Green. This is what sucks about doing these position previews right now, is that we just don't know what is going on at these position groups because we weren't told anything in the spring. So we don't know how certain guys look during the spring to be able to give you the correct assessment as to where exactly everyone's at. The thing with Jason Robinson Jr. is that I think, him being a guy that was with the team back in the spring, that certainly helps him out there. So it's not the craziest thing that he could push Javarius Green a little bit, but I just don't know how big of an impact he's really going to have this year. That's one that I'm hoping that I could be wrong on there, though. I mentioned Dayton Sneed at the wide receiver position as well, former walk-on at Tennessee. Really, a guy that I think Carolina brought in here to try to get his brother in the 2026 recruiting cycle. I think that's really the biggest reason that they brought him in. Maybe he ends up making an effect, for Carolina somewhere down the line. I don't think that this is the year that he ends up doing it. I think it's going to take him some time and he'll be buried on the depth chart.